search ideas which I do not pursue in the project in which I'm employed at the Ethics Center, but these ideas are something that that follows me up from my dissertation. Well, in order to introduce it to you, I would like to find out how to switch the slides. That works. So I will start with the initial questions with which I'm initially occupied. They come from environmental politics. So I would like to understand how to justify certain policies in the field of global environmental change. And those problems are, for instance, like a justification of a climate policy target. There are several policy options which are discussed as well in the academics as in the policy field. One is to do nothing. The other is a moderate policy like stabilization of greenhouse concentrations at a certain level of 500 ppm, and a more radical level to reduce the greenhouse gases concentration at the pre-industrial or nearly pre-industrial level. Or another example is comes from adaptation policies, where we know that the sea level will rise in the next century by an uncertain amount. And again, we are facing different policy options like doing nothing and hoping that the rise will not be that high, strengthening the dikes, that is a kind of technological adaptation, or even more radical resettlement of inhabitants from the areas which are in danger. And the question is so how to justify policy options and more among these possibilities. So it might seem that that is not a theoretical, or from a theoretical point of view, there is no problem, because we have a well-established theory for decision making under risk and probably also uncertainty. That is the expected utility theory, which says, well, everything what we have done, what we have to do is to find out preferences of decision makers and their belief about all possible outcomes of the available options of actions. And according to the expected utility theory, if these utilities and probabilities are specified, the decision is determined. Well, I'm going to point out two shortcomings of the theory, which motivate the questions I'm thinking about now. And the one is that the expected utility theory cannot represent a certain normatively significant property, that's the riskiness of an option of action. And today I would like to focus on a recently suggested further development of the expected utility theory, which Lara Buchak proposed, that the risk-weighted expected utility theory, and mention some concerns I have with the risk-weighted or with Buchak's proposal for the representation of risk attitudes. And this will explain how I think about specifications of principles for justifying attitudes to risk. And the other point is that the other shortcoming of the expected utility theory is that it cannot justify decisions under uncertainty. Uncertainty is a situation in which no unique numerical values for probabilities or moral evaluations utilities are available. And there I'm currently thinking about principles for dynamic decision making under uncertainty. That will very well briefly demonstrate in which direction I'm thinking there. So let us start with a representation of the risk attitude. So this problem with the expected utility theory is quite old and discussed very widely. So there are certain type of examples of lotteries in which the expected utility theory implies something which we cannot observe from people's preferences, and that is quite problematic for the expected utility theory because the preferences should be or the utility should be derived from the preferences. And the structure is somehow that the expected utility theory implies that if individuals prefer one lottery 1 to lottery 2, then they must also prefer lottery 3 to lottery 4, but we do not observe that. So proponents of the expected utility theory try to explain that, so they can claim that the observed preferences are irrational, or they can claim that the description of lotteries is inadequate. And there is another explanation which says, well, the lotteries just differ in their riskiness, and the expected utility theory represents these property of riskiness in a confusing way, because it can represent it only by its utility function, by the form of the utility function. However, utility is something different than riskiness. So utility is a normative property which refers to a particular social state, but riskiness is a property which depends on a distribution of outcomes in different possible states. So there are different states of the world to which they refer. So, and if you agree that this alternative explanation is more elegant than the explanation by the proponents of the expected utility theory, then we are leaving the expected utility theory and are in the framework of a kind of a risk-adjusted instrumental rationality, which said that that the decision what ought to be done is determined not merely by the moral value or the utility of the possible outcomes and its the epistemic attitude of the decision maker, but there is a third property to which I would come if I, now it works again. That is the risk attitude. So, and we have three, or an additional property which determines the choice of the action. So that at this stage we are in a formal framework, and the question arises: so what does this risk attitude mean, and can we justify a decision principle on the basis of these terms? And and that is, there is also a long debate about how to interpret the risk attitude. So it might be an additional evaluative property of an action. It could be an additional belief, a certain weight on the epistemic attitudes of decision makers, sometimes also called as optimism or pessimism preference. And it could also be an additional psychological component, preference of decision makers to balance a scenario with a certain certain utility and epistemic attitude against another scenario with a different utility and epistemic stance. And this the third suggestion is something that Laura Buchak proposed and also defended in her suggestion of a risk-weighted expected utility theory. And so very briefly, the idea is that decisions are determined by three subjective factors, so preference, possible outcomes and degrees of belief about the occurrence of possible outcomes. That is, according, here she sticks to the expected utility theory, but she introduced also this third factor, which is a certain willingness to trade off less likely outcomes with higher utility, with highly likely outcomes with lower utility risk attitude. And what she makes is also that she proves the representation theorem, which shows that if preferences satisfies certain axioms, then there is a unique probability function, unique risk function, and a utility function, which is unique up to positive monotone transformations. And then there follows the decision rule that rational decision makers ought to choose, and whose preferences satisfy the axioms, ought to choose the action which had the highest risk-weighted expected utility. So, and my objections or comments to Buchak's proposal are that I disagree with her interpretation of the risk attitude. So I do not believe that it should be interpreted as a psychological factor extracted from preferences over lotteries, but rather as a risk attitude, which is morally constrained and which tracks moral reasons. I'm not very sure how Buchak exactly sees that. She's a little bit ambivalent on that. So it might be that we do not disagree, but rather. So then my position is a comment, and just also in order to understand, so the dialectic of my comment is that since I'm not discussing the axioms, I'm not discussing the axioms, so the preferences axioms, and I'm not discussing whether they are rational. And I also do not discuss the representation theorem. So I do not have no objections against the maximization of the risk expected utility principle. But I believe that what follows is the normative role of this principle, and according to my interpretation, it is merely a principle of instrumental rationality. So decision makers instrumentally rationally ought to choose, but not of morality. And I am interested somehow in this moral principles, and that will motivate my further ideas. So now, why do I disagree with the idea that that the risk attitude is something that could be derived from our preferences? That is something to which Laura Buchak pointed out herself by discussing cases of future generations. So consider decision situations whose outcomes will affect currently not existing individuals or other morally considerable beings. So according to the risk-weighted expected utility theory, we need risk attitudes. However, the individuals who will be affected by the outcomes do not exist. So the question arises, whose attitudes towards risk-taking should be taken into account. There are different possibilities. So we could take the preferences of decision makers, of aggregate current generations preferences, or involve an additional moral principle. I thought that that proponents of expected utility theory will somehow stick to the first two options. However, Laura Buchak proposes the third option. So she introduces what she calls a default risk principle, which says if the risk attitude of the affected persons is not known, choose under the assumption that the affected person has the most risk avoidant attitude within reason. And this idea of the most risk avoidant attitude she justifies referring to further moral principles. the basic idea is so you should do maximally to avoid harm to others. So this way, so the risk principle Buchak introduces is a moral principle. So there are moral reasons which constrain the risk attitude. If that is the case, so that the risk attitude is morally justifiable, then the question arises why it should be justified. It should be morally justified only in case when the preferences are not known, but not also in the case when the preferences, or also in the case when preferences, when we know preferences and see that the preferences deviate from what is morally justified. And the more plausible position would be to say, well, the risk preferences should track the morally justified risk attitude if it is justifiable in principle. The other worry about Buchak risk principle, which I only briefly mentioned here, is that I doubt that the risk attitude should count as a default risk attitude, because it would imply that, for instance, radical social reforms are never justified by default as long as risk preferences of the affected are not known. And that implication seems to me to be implausible. And well, that situation that we need a kind of morally justified risk principles leads me to, well, to try to make explicit a plurality of threshold-based risk attitudes. Here are some two examples of two extreme principles, which I think that they hold. One of them is a precautionary principle, which says if it is seriously possible that some of the available actions will lead to morally catastrophic outcomes, and if the best possible outcomes are morally non-significant, then decision makers ought to take only the seriously possible outcomes into account and choose the actions according to the maximin rule. So in this principle, it works on the basis of two thresholds. So on the one hand, there is an epistemic thresholds, which said that, or should specify which outcomes are seriously possible. So there is a certain threshold in the credence about the outcomes. And the second threshold is about what counts as morally catastrophic outcomes. So there is a threshold in the moral value. An analogous principle is just the opposite of the precautionary principle, the risk-prone principle, which said that if it is seriously possible that some of the available actions will lead to high moral outcomes, morally just outcomes, and the worst outcomes are not significant, then decision makers are allowed to take only the seriously possible outcomes into account and to choose according to the maximax rule. Again, here are certain thresholds, epistemic and moral thresholds, which provide the conditions, or which are balanced and provide the conditions for the normative rule. And I believe that between these two extremes, there is a plurality of further principles in which these epistemic and moral thresholds are balanced or weighted, and which I somehow hope to make explicit. Well, and very briefly to the second idea, that is the justification of decisions under uncertainty. That is the case in regarding several global environmental change policies that so reasons do not determine a unique moral value and a unique epistemic attitude about the possible outcomes of the available possible policy options. Well, some subjectivists would say that's not a problem. We can derive evaluations of outcomes from desires and beliefs, but what we then observe are highly controversial moral and epistemic evaluations, and we get broad ranges of moral and epistemically acceptable values, such that the cases I introduced at the beginning, the policy options between doing nothing, a moderate policy and a radical policy, they have quite similar outcomes. So in the best case, nothing happens, as in the business as usual case, or we even gain something, higher quality of life. But in the worst case, all these options can lead to catastrophic outcomes, and we cannot assign probabilities or merely ranges of probabilities if we stick to subjective probabilities. And the question is there a possibility to justify a choice among these options if this structure represents the best available knowledge? And my idea is to consider those decisions as dynamic decisions, and to focus on the process of realization of options, and to make the claim that this process of realization of the policy options provides another normatively significant criterion. And if you consider that, the idea is that, or the idea is to make explicit what the property of controllability means. So to try to find or to make explicit what it means to be able to control or to better control processes of realization of certain policies. And the idea here is somehow to describe, despite the possibility that all policies can lead to this behind the normative threshold, the maladaptive space in this graph, there are some which which have a better ability to be controlled. And the idea is, so my idea is then to focus on properties, or so on the number of decision nodes, and on the difference in the moral value between consecutive outcomes, and by thereby to propose explications for this notion of controllability. Thanks a lot for your attention, and so now I managed to explain what I wanted to explain about my two current research tasks.